And I was in at Farnborough filming this form. So I got in with about 2 minutes to spare. Certainly not this one.
Yeah, last night it was very good. What, the one where it was
Find out. Yeah, but there's nothing to do with that. Sorry, I'll just have to record it in camera and then. Yeah, no worries. All right.
Good afternoon, my friends. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to get straight to the point. The disorder we have seen on our streets in the past 2 weeks is completely unacceptable. Every single perpetrator and instigator must be investigated, prosecuted, and severely punished. And as a country, we have some serious soul-searching ahead of us. It'd be easy to take solace, as we so often do at moments like these, in the small acts of kindness, of service and humanity, amid the anger, pain and destruction. The people who ran towards danger to shield those innocent little girls who were attacked by a knifeman. The courageous police officers who stood firm against the malicious mob, against the thugs and rioters. The volunteers who picked up the pieces, swept streets, and quite literally mended fences. That all those people deserve our gratitude and respect. And of course they do represent the best of us. But we cannot use these rays of sunshine to ignore those whose actions reflect the very worst of our society. The racist thugs who attacked a mosque in Southport, the sectarian gang who burned down a Muslim-owned shop in Belfast, the mob who set fire to a hotel housing migrants in Rotherham. We need to ask ourselves how we got here and what we must do about it. Too often over the last 2 decades or more, we have avoided being brutally honest about the underlying social unrest across society, preferring instead the warmth and false comfort of denial and complacency. Bombs have been detonated and we've moved on. Attempted terror attacks have gone without much comment. Wicked and violent crimes have taken place with little said or done. In May, a 9-year-old girl was shot in a drive-by attack in London. 2 weeks later, 3 little girls, aged 6, 7 and 9, roughly the age of my own children, were stabbed to death as they danced to Taylor Swift in Southport. The denial has taken many forms, from displacement to forgetfulness. My friend, Sir David Amess, was murdered nearly 3 years ago by a fanatical Islamist, and instead we found ourselves, for no related reason, debating online civility. And then, 4 years ago, 3 gay men were murdered in an unprovoked attack in a park in Reading. We were told that we would debate what happened and why after the trial. By the time the attacker was in prison, the country had moved on, and of course, we never did have that conversation. Sometimes the problem is partisanship. Those who should know better are blinded by politics and fail to respect the hard-won British right of equality before the law. After the attack on those little girls in Southport, Nigel Farage claimed the truth is being withheld from us. Later, he justified amplifying this false information by saying he had believed influencers like Andrew Tate and chose to condemn the breakdown of law and order preceding the riots, but not the riots themselves. Now, I want to be clear, this is not leadership. It is deeply irresponsible and dangerous. Later, when gangs of masked men gathered in Birmingham brandishing weapons and, live on camera, threatened female journalists and attempted to slash the tyres of broadcast vans, Jess Phillips, a Home Office minister, chose to justify their behaviour instead of condemning it. Because these were not far-right hooligans, but young Muslim men. One man attacked by these vigilantes ended up in hospital. This was a failure of leadership just as surely as that of Nigel Farage. And it is not the only failure of leadership by Keir Starmer's government over these last 2 weeks. Today, I want to talk about the future of our police and criminal justice system and the problems we face with violence, extremism, and social trust. This isn't about the state. This is about who we are as a society. But first, I want to consider the issue of leadership. This has been the government's first real test, and the Prime Minister fell short. When we needed a strong government, we got a party in the mindset of opposition. We needed a leader. We got a lawyer waiting for the case to reach court. These are early days for the government, and government isn't easy, but government isn't a game either. It is more than press releases and retweets, and you can't be wise with hindsight, something Labour mastered in opposition. You have to be determined and aware throughout. You have to be ready to do the job from day one. Public order is too precious, too essential to all of us to be taken for granted. I have personally seen the cost of failure too often around the world and know that we simply cannot afford to allow chaos to grow. But peace and order does not come about spontaneously. It's made possible by the rule of law, reliable justice, and the willingness to use force where necessary. It rests upon intangible assets, social trust, reciprocity, respect for the fairness of the law, and the knowledge that we all have a stake in our shared security. As Conservatives, we understand that order is not the product of freedom, rather our freedom depends on order. None of us are bystanders. We don't have that luxury. Once lost, public order can be difficult to regain, and social unrest can rear its head, which is why the police response to disorder must always be swift. We sometimes hear of the need to go softly, softly and to make arrests later. But visible lawlessness is radicalising. It encourages others to join in and to commit crime. This was a problem that reared its head during the pro-Palestine marches. As Security Minister, I constantly had to encourage the police to make arrests on the day as crimes were being committed, rather than waiting until after the protest had finished. Once people cross the line, they need to be met with immediate and uncompromising force. Sophisticated capabilities need to be deployed, of course, and instigators need to be made an example of. But on the street, sheer numbers, physical force, and a willingness to deploy it determine whether order prevails or not. During a time of national disorder, the police need the total backing of the government, in substance, not just in rhetoric. And that is where Keir Starmer stumbled. The riots began on Tuesday, the 30th of July, but the Prime Minister did not chair COBRA, the government's all-agency response meeting, until 1 week later. At one point, he talked of creating a standing army of public order police officers. This was a newsline without content. We already have officers with specialist training and mutual aid, where police forces send others to support each other. Of course, we never did find out if Sir Keir was talking about what already existed, or if he was proposing something new that could never have been created quickly enough. It was, in truth, a PR line and not a policy. If he had chaired a daily COBRA meeting with senior police officers, the security services, the army and others, the Prime Minister could have given the police more of what they needed. They could have cancelled leave, extended mutual aid, and confronted the rioters earlier with an overwhelming police presence. But this is not what we saw. We did not see the leadership we needed. They could have backfilled policing roles by calling up all special constables and using the army for backup office duties. They could have decided, before the shameful scenes outside the hotel in Rotherham, to allow the police to use appropriate force. But they did none of this. And when Jess Phillips sought to justify a militia, vigilantism and violence, to excuse a militia on our streets, Keir Starmer should have sacked her, because ministers must always defend the principle of equality before the law. In all, these riots lasted for more than a week, longer than the more severe riots of 2011. The lessons were already there. They weren't applied. The riots could and should have been stopped earlier. Now, the riots have, rightly, thrown up lots of questions about the police and our criminal justice system. Are public order policing tactics right? Why is it that some are now claiming that there is two-tier policing? Does the criminal justice system have the capacity it needs? Conservatives should always be good friends to the police. They uphold the law and order that we cherish. But friends speak honestly to each other. Now, I want a tougher, bigger police force. But that also requires better police leadership and the honesty to address recent failings. Now, politicians of all stripes have avoided the raw honesty that this country needs. And if we are brutally honest, policing and the wider criminal justice system are not working as they should. This goes beyond the perma-crisis at the Met and the appalling scandals from Wayne Couzens to the murdered sisters, Bibba Henry and Nicole Smallman, and the finding of the inquiry into the murder of private investigator Daniel Morgan, that London's police are, and I quote, institutionally corrupt. Claiming there is two-tier policing, some critics of the police have compared the recent riots with the anti-Israel marches in London, or the direct action by Just Stop Oil. But that's not quite right. There is a difference between public protests in which a minority turned violent and disorder started deliberately by those intent on violence. There is a difference between blocking a road, even if that's a dangerous and selfish criminal act, and plotting to burn down shops, mosques and hotels, or carrying weapons on the streets. The right comparison for these riots is with 2011. Then the police were robust, and the judges, quite rightly, very tough. And yet there is something to criticise. The approach to public order policing has been inconsistent and, too often, too weak. There was inaction in the face of blatant criminality during the anti-Israel protests. And the justification for not wanting to ban these marches was that the threshold in the Public Order Act 1986 was not reached. But if the Chief Constable did not believe banning the marches would prevent serious public disorder, how could they later claim that arresting lawmakers, how could they later claim that arresting lawbreakers at the time would lead to wider disorder? This is quite obviously a contradiction. Last week, we saw a senior officer from West Midlands Police explain that officers had been absent during violence by young Muslim men because they had discussed their plans with, and I quote, community leaders to understand the style of policing we needed to deliver. Now, criminal acts committed during protests, whether by Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, or the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, were not stopped with police seeming to stand aside by the wayside. And in Birmingham, police deferred to so-called community leaders while pubs and cars were attacked, windows broken and citizens intimidated. This is not, as the police oath requires, policing without fear or favour. No police officer should ever tolerate the presence of a militia, no matter what the provocation or the cause they claim. The intrusion of politics, the politics of protest, or the politics of the self-appointed community leaders into policing must simply end. We need a new programme of police reform to make sure that it does. The institutions of policing should be reviewed and reformed including the College of Policing and the National Police Chiefs Council. The culture of police leadership, how leaders are recruited, trained and rewarded, must change. The structure of policing, not least the Met's confused mix of national and local responsibilities, and its reporting to the Mayor and the Home Secretary, with each blaming the other, must also change. Removing counter-terrorism policing from the Met to create a new national security police force whose focus is not just counter-terror, but also state threats, would be one way of doing so. Our response to conspiracy theories and disinformation, and our response to the truth, when those in authority find it inconvenient, cannot be silence. The antidote to conspiracy is transparency, and transparency is vital to knowledge. Where possible, the police, subject to the protection of the right to a fair trial, should err towards sharing more information, not less. Because silence feeds lies and allows our enemies to exploit the darkness and to spread disinformation and to try to divide us. In the criminal justice system, we also need change. It is true that we do not have the capacity in the prison estate that we need. There's little point in spending vast sums on more police officers who arrest more criminals only to see them be given trivial or non-custodial sentences. Research shows that only 1/10 of criminals commit more than half of all crimes. And even with this group, a number of super-prolific criminals are responsible for an even greater share. The first rioters to be convicted sum up this problem. Derek Drummond had 14 previous convictions from 19 offences and a history of violence. Declan Gearan had 13 previous convictions from 18 offences. Adam Wharton had 16 previous offences from 26 offences, including robbery and burglary. As more people are prosecuted, we are likely to find many repeat offenders amongst them. Now, according to research compiled by my friend Neil O'Brien MP, the number of offenders with more than 50 previous convictions who were convicted but not sent to prison rose from 1,299 in 2007 to 3,196 in 2018. The number of offenders with more than 100 convictions but who still avoided jail doubled to 295. Over the years of Neil's study, 206,000 criminals with 25 previous convictions avoided prison for their next offence, and instead more were handed community sentences. Now, this is madness, and under Labour, the problem is only going to get worse. Just as he is set to raise taxes, Keir Starmer is doing here what he fundamentally believes in. In this case, releasing criminals early, while pretending that he is forced to do so because that is the inheritance from the Tories. Now, we know it's nonsense for two reasons. First, he chose to appoint a prisons minister, Lord Timpson, who thinks that only 1/3 of current prisoners should be behind bars. And second, since the riots, the government has done what it had previously said was impossible. It's created an extra 567 prison places from within the existing estate. Yet the government's mass prisoner release scheme doesn't start until September. Now, nobody denies that there are problems with prison capacity, and of course we should be better at prisoner rehabilitation and much better at probation. But prison punishes offenders and takes dangerous and prolific criminals out of circulation, allowing the rest of us to live in peace. We should be updating and improving our prisoners, not releasing criminals. So as well as police reform, we need probation and prison reform. And we do need more prison capacity. But we also need to look a little deeper at the kind of society that we have become. The story of the last 2 weeks is not only one of violence and destruction, it's a story of a nation divided, the result of social unrest we've allowed to percolate below the surface. A story of a senseless, horrific crime against innocent children, of people quick to believe baseless claims that a perpetrator was an illegal immigrant and a Muslim, of people taking to the streets and targeting innocents on the basis of their race and their religion, of thugs so wrapped up in the thrill of destruction that they attacked their own neighbourhoods of vigilantes forming groups and attacking innocent people themselves, of police officers openly admitting that they defer to unelected, unaccountable community leaders, and politicians of right and left picking and choosing who they condemn instead of upholding the rule of law. Sadly, this is not the first warning sign. We can go back to the riots in northern English towns in 2001 and read the Cantle report that followed. We can read the Casey report of 2016 and find the same conclusions. Cantle argued separate educational arrangements, community and voluntary bodies, employment, places of worship, language, social and cultural networks means that many communities operate on the basis of a series of parallel lives. Casey found discrimination and disadvantage, feeding a sense of grievance and unfairness, isolating communities from modern British society. She also found high levels of social and economic isolation in some places and cultural and religious practices that hold citizens back and run contrary to British values and sometimes to our laws. We could commission another report following these riots. We already know what it would find. Now, I'll address the economic challenges another time, but for now, let me say that too many people live in communities shorn of civic pride and social capital. Too many have lost their sense of self as they are denied opportunity and purpose in their lives. Many people are told, in effect, that they are not needed, that they have too little to contribute. They are parked on benefits and forgotten. And social trust is collapsing. Instead of trying to build a sense of national unity under one civic identity, through a common culture, solidarity, and a shared understanding of the obligations, not just the rights of citizenship, we have, for decades, pursued the opposite, promoting difference between communities instead of shared values and shared beliefs. In recent years, we've seen this policy turbocharged. We've seen equality of opportunity give way to critical race theory, while the root causes of inequalities go ignored. Activist groups warp the language of inclusion to get what they want. Universities indulge in ideologies of grievance instead of transmitting knowledge. Schools, museums, and galleries apologize for our country's history instead of objectively explaining it and, yes, celebrating it. We have seen interethnic tensions and violence in Liverpool 2 weeks ago, in Leicester 2 years ago, and in other towns and cities before and since. We have seen sectarianism in our elections and even in the House of Commons. After years of militant identity politics, much of it imported, we have seen the politicisation of race by extremists and thugs. The right's response to this cannot be more of the same. Yet we've already seen more than enough from Labour to know that that is exactly what we're going to get. Ministers are promising a legal definition of Islamophobia, creating a blasphemy law for one faith when anti-Muslim hatred is already a crime. This will undermine free speech, afford special protections uniquely to the beliefs of one religion, and protect extremists from scrutiny and investigation. And we can already see that activists on the left are trying to use the riots to silence those with mainstream concerns about immigration. We need a government that unites, not divides, that recognises that all citizens are equal and represented by the structures of our democracy, not by sectarian affiliations or self-appointed community leaders. We need patriotism and purpose, the patriotism that sees us all part of one nation, and the purpose of seeing the goal of our shared prosperity and security. And we need to end the culture of denial, the tendency to move hurriedly on from acts of extreme violence, to obfuscate about the identities and motives of the perpetrators, and to take comfort in the mantra of diversity. The truth is, diversity can bring many great advantages, but it also brings many great challenges that need to be successfully navigated. Denial creates a vacuum in which extremists of all kinds and claiming to represent different ethnic and religious identities can divide us. So the mission must be for those of us in the mainstream to lead, to tell the truth about the scale of the challenges, to admit that too many people live without opportunity, purpose, or hope, to admit that too many of our towns and cities are divided, to admit that the politics of sectarianism, the emphasis on what sets us apart rather than what brings us together, has failed, and to accept that unless we do this differently, things will not get better and could yet get much worse. But this is not a counsel of despair. If we're honest with ourselves, the solutions will follow the reform of our police and criminal justice system, the renewal and, in some cases, replacement of our national institutions, the restoration of pride in our community and our country, its history and its culture, the rejection of militant identity politics in all its forms, the construction of a new economic model, and the promise of a new social contract, in which we understand our obligations as well as our rights, and we all have the respect and the self-respect that comes with fending for ourselves, providing for our families, and contributing to our common life together. It will take honesty, and it will take courage, and it will take leadership. But of course it can be done, because what needs to be done in the national interest must be done. And because this is Britain, my country, your country, the greatest country on earth. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Claire. I can't see you, but I'm sure you're here. Oh, there you are. Sorry, forgive me. Claire, Daily Mail.
I was just wondering, you talked about the sort of disinformation
Yeah.
with the riots. How would you go about policing social media and making it a better place to stop this kind of stuff?
So we've already set out in the Online Safety Act, which of course was passed recently. But we also need to recognise that when publishers, when social media platforms make decisions to publish or emphasise or boost content, they are making a decision. And we need to recognise that decisions matter. Helen, I can see you there.
You talked about doing serious soul searching. How much responsibility, if any, do you think your party should take for the situation we find ourselves in?
Well, let's be honest, this is not a single incident. It's part of a pattern, as I described. It's, the Cantor report, the Casey report, these go back decades. We all have a responsibility. And the reality is it's not just central government either. We can see that different communities, different leadership levels in this country have had different challenges. So this is something that we need to do as a nation. I don't want to be partisan about this. This isn't a partisan statement. This is about making sure that we govern this country, our great country, for the benefit of all. And sadly, the riots have just demonstrated that that's not working. Christian, where are you? Is Calgi here? Oh, there you are, buddy. I can't believe I missed you. Sorry. Must be the first time that's ever happened.
Mass immigration, segregated communities, lack of prison places, weak justice for criminals, importing identity politics from abroad, looking at cracking down on freedom of speech, collapsing social trust. This was just a shopping list of Tory failure, wasn't it? Or are you really going to change the party to be radical enough to get things right next time you're in power?
Look, this is a list of areas that we must improve on. And it's not Tory or Labour. It's a list of areas that this country must get better at. And this is not just, as I say, this is not just about central government. This is about operational leadership of police officers at every level. This is about the leadership that we see in the devolved administrations and in devolved mayoralties and areas like that over the coming years. We need to actually focus on what we're talking about here. Focus on the areas that divide us. Focus on the sectarian politics that have separated us. Because we know, we've seen, I'm afraid, that you can import, if you like, you can import division, you can import ideas of separateness, or you can remember who you are. One of the great things about this country, one of the things I love about this country, is we don't qualify Britishness. We're not like some countries where you're a hyphenated nation. You're just British, and we should be deeply proud of that. Tomorrow. There you are. Thank you.
Hi. Can you be more specific about this culture of denial that we're talking about? You gave some examples of Islamist extremism. Is that what you're saying governments have been in denial about? you try and do about that when you worked at the Home Office? And can I also ask, are you saying that these pro-Palestine marches we've seen should have been banned or just more aggressively policed?
So look, when I was the security minister, one of the things I was working on was on the political influence that we see through different areas on our own country. And we've seen that, some of it by the kind of hostile states that you've heard me talking about many times, and we've also seen it, sadly, through different groups who are seeking to weaponize culture or faith in different ways. And we need to be absolutely clear that politics in this country is conducted by the free association of free people, by British citizens getting together. It is not conducted. It is absolutely unacceptable that it's conducted by anybody trying to influence from abroad. And that's exactly why I set up the Defending Democracy Task Force. So that's exactly where my focus went. Now, on the pro-Gaza marches, I was pretty clear at the time, and I remain clear, that if the police are going to take an operational decision, so I have concerns about freedom of speech across society, but the freedom to shout fire in a crowded theatre, I mean, you probably learned in your journalist legal training, is not the same as freedom of speech is not unqualified. The truth is freedom of speech is freedom of expression. It's the ability to associate and to share ideas. And we need to be very careful that when we say various freedoms are limited, that it's not just being wrong that is limited. It's not just being mistaken that's limited. It's when you're actively doing harm. And that's where we've got to balance these rights. And frankly, some of the reporting online and social media about some of these different incidents has been, frankly, stretching the truth quite markedly. It isn't just that somebody said something, it's that they also recommended how to attack, how to do harm, how to bring violence to individuals. That's not the same. Noah, where are you? Oh, there you are. Sorry, forgive me.
So you did criticise Keir Starmer a bit for waiting a week before he convened the Cobra meeting. However, the Prime Minister has received praise from some quarters for managing to sort of quash the riots in the space of a week. And on Wednesday, there was meant to be a whole lot more, and that didn't transpire. Would you give him any credit at all, or do you think he's completely failed? And how much more quickly and better would you have acted?
So look, I think the example is one that Keir Starmer should have known very well. He was, after all, Director of Public Prosecutions in 2011. He was actually there. And David Cameron immediately called Cobra, did so every day, and made sure the police had the resources. I think, I may have not quite got the numbers wrong, but I think it was 16,000 officers he put on the streets. And those riots stopped within a week. These riots went on longer and they were less serious. He could have gripped it. He chose not to use the institutions of the state and still to run as though he was in opposition. That's not how government works. Nick, where are you? Oh, they are. Sorry.
You mentioned on the marches you had to instruct the police when you were a minister to go and make arrests on the day.
Sorry, ministers can't instruct officers to make arrests. Yeah.
I just wondered, do you think that the police have effectively become too frightened to intervene in some of these events? And why do you think that's the case?
So look, this is the point I was setting out in the speech. It's the politics that have intervened in protest. And it's not just the politics, as in partisan politics, that we see in Westminster, but it's the politics of having community leaders or feeling that other areas are able to be dealt with later. And that's why I was clear time and again with senior police officers. And let me be quite clear, I have nothing but praise for the individual officers on the ground who show remarkable courage whenever there's protest and whenever there's unrest. I mean, it's extraordinary courage to go into the street and seek to keep us all safe. But in senior officers who did not take the decision to carry out arrests on the day. And what I point to here is the incoherence of that decision. If the protest can go ahead under the Public Order Act, then so can the arrests. Chris.
Quick questions. Would you allow Nigel Farage into your party? You've been talking in the past. Join. You said too many people live in communities shorn of pride. Shouldn't you say sorry after 14 years in power to your party? And just finally, 3 in 5 voters don't care who comes lead of your party. Does that worry you?
So, first of all, this is a speech about some rather important events that have happened in our country over the last few days. It's not about our party. I'm very happy to answer the 2 questions that you asked about that, which is not on keeping the king's peace, your focus is wrong. Anna, I've lost. Oh, there you are. Thank you.
You talk about inconsistency of policing. Do you believe that that inconsistency is kind of consistently directed at certain groups rather than others? As in, do you think that police treat certain groups differently to the way they treat other groups?
You're pushing me down a yes, Prime Minister route. There is no consistent inconsistency. They are inconsistent. And their inconsistency is what makes them consistent. Are there any other questions? Henry, sorry.
I have two questions, but they are both on topic. First, in 2016, the government and Right Damages Act recommitted to the principle that police should be financially liable for damage.
That's right.
However, the police can get around this liability by not referring to disorderly riots. How are ideas in government is that loophole not caught? And what would you do about it? Second, on your idea of a new national security police, we are having a speech as a response to public order, and yet you've only mentioned counter-terrorism. Would your new security police force include the TSG and public order laws, or would you focus purely on counter-terrorism?
So on the first question, look, the financial consequences for policing of rioting can be very high, and you're right that police forces choose language carefully to avoid the consequences. And that's why I think it should be determined independently rather than by the individual force. But the reality is that the real challenge is not a financial one, it's a leadership one, as I say again. And that's where, I think we need to be very clear that the leadership of individual officers and the leadership training that individual police leaders get is so important. That's why I talk about the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing, both of which do important work, but renewal and reform is important as well. And so when we look at the national security policing, I put in there those areas that are genuinely national, that are actually cross UK policing elements. You could include some TSG elements, but actually what's often more important than the officers in the front line, which require remarkable courage, is the support element, that search of either social media or state actors to make sure that the support is there to make sure that before an incident occurs, it can be dealt with. Yes?
Kate Dublin from The Independent. So the difference with the riots this time around, many experts argue, is the role of social media. Would you support an inquiry that would specifically look at the role of social media? And, if I may, how do you think Keir Starmer is dealing with the current threat from Iran?
So, on the social media question, do you remember what was described as the cause of the riots in 2011? It was BlackBerry Messenger. Right? I mean, there will always be a system of communication that is responsible for the latest outbreak of whatever it is, right? That's not the core. The core is the leadership and response and understanding that communities divided lead to significant unrest. And so there are two issues here. The first is how do we address the division in our society, and the second is how do we address police leadership, I'm afraid. On Iran, I'm afraid I'm not going to comment on that. And the reason I'm not going to comment, because it is an entirely fair question, is that this is an extremely tense moment. The behaviour of the Iranian state in recent years has been unbelievably threatening and could lead to very, very serious harm, not just to us and to our friends, but to many others in the region. Let's not forget, this is, after all, the regime that has murdered quite literally hundreds of thousands of people in Syria and has tried to bring death to many, many others around the world. So I will keep my counsel on that, if you don't mind. Yes.
You said to Chris that you wouldn't allow Nigel Farage to join the Conservative Party. Would you rule out doing the deal from the UK?
Yes. Forgive me, my hearing isn't.
Sorry, you talked about culture denial, and one of the elements of the attacks in Southport was that it was violence against
Absolutely.
girls. We've seen a stabbing of 11-year-old girl in London just yesterday. How do you think you address this?
Yeah, look, I don't know how many of you were watching the TV and the various social media in the last day or two, but there was a photo of one of the children who was murdered, and it was quite clearly her first Holy Communion photo. My daughter's 7 and is going to do her first Holy Communion, well, I hope, this year. It's absolutely heartbreaking to see it. It's one of the most painful images that I think any of us have seen, and anybody who's a parent, anybody who's got nephews, nieces, will understand that it's just agonizing. And the horror for those people and for that family, I can't imagine it. And I was incredibly impressed by the leadership in Southport, actually. Councillor Thomas de Freitas got all the political parties together in what I have to say was an extremely impressive act of unity to condemn that horrific violence. I think this is one of those moments where it goes beyond politics, it goes beyond anything. It is simple horror of the actions committed against 3 innocent and frankly angelic children. Forgive me, I must now leave you, but thank you very much indeed for coming this afternoon. I'm very grateful for your time.